In the windswept plains of Cedar Ridge, Texas, where dreams dried up faster than morning dew, an 8-year-old girl was about to make a desperate plea. A plea to a wealthy stranger that would unravel a decade of secrets buried so deep they'd poisoned the very ground beneath their feet, and in doing so, it would change 3 lives forever. The little girl's name was Nola Dean, and she'd watched her mama, Raina Gale, work their failing ranch until her hands cracked and bled like old leather. She'd seen the bank notices pile up, stacking like tumbleweeds against their porch. She watched the hope drain from her mama's eyes with each passing sunset, a little more light gone each day. So when Jake Tate rolled into town, he looked like something out of a storybook. His carriage was gleaming black. His silver spurs caught the light, but it was the 10 years of guilt weighing on his shoulders that Nola saw. The adults, they just saw the expensive suit, the cold stare of a businessman. But Nola saw the cowboy who once shared their table, the man who once shared her mama's heart. The question was, would the man who abandoned them when things got tough risk his brand new fortune to save the family he'd left behind? The morning sun painted the Gale homestead in shades of amber and desperation. Raina stood at her kitchen window, the same window she'd stood at for years, but today the view was different. Today, the shadows creeping across the land looked like monsters, whispering of foreclosure. Her calloused fingers traced the simple gold band on her hand. She still wore it. It had been 6 years since her husband Clem passed, but taking it off felt like a betrayal she couldn't stomach. The kitchen told the story of their slow decline. Shelves that once bowed heavy with mason jars of preserves were now mostly bare. The cast-iron stove, Clem's wedding gift, still worked, but the wood box beside it held only a few precious logs. Everything was running out. Time most of all. "Mama," Nola's voice cut through the quiet. "The horses are acting strange again." Her little boots scraped against the weathered planks of the porch. At 8 years old, she had her mama's steel backbone and her late daddy's gentle heart. But life was teaching her lessons too harsh for any child. "Strange how, baby girl?" Raina turned from the window, her hands automatically smoothing her worn apron. Nola pushed through the screen door, a treasured rag doll tucked under one arm. The doll's yarn hair was faded, its button eyes hanging by a thread, loved nearly to pieces. "They keep looking toward the main road," Nola said. "Their ears are all pricked up like they're expecting company. And old Buck won't eat. He just stands there, snorting at the wind. Animals sense change before we do. Clem used to say that." Raina felt the folded bank notice in her apron pocket. It seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart, a constant nagging reminder. Their time here was measured in weeks now, not years, not even months. Just then, a dust cloud on the horizon caught her eye. It was small at first, a faint puff against the blue sky, but it was growing, and it was coming their way. She watched as a carriage appeared, but it wasn't the simple farm wagon that usually traveled these roads. This thing belonged in Dallas, or maybe even further. It was black and gleaming, pulled by 2 perfectly matched horses that spoke of careful breeding and expensive feed. "Mama, it's like something from a fairy tale," Nola whispered, her nose pressed flat against the window pane. "Do you think there's a prince inside?" Raina's mouth went dry. Her heart started hammering against her ribs. The carriage was turning onto their lane. She'd known someone once who dreamed of carriages like that, a boy who'd spoken of the fortune he'd make, the fine things he'd buy for her. But that was another lifetime ago, before disappointment taught her the bitter difference between dreams and dust. The carriage pulled to a stop right in their yard, and the world tilted sideways. The man stepping down from the interior. 10 years had changed him, but not enough. Silver touched his temples now. Lines of worry or success creased the corners of his eyes. But she would have recognized Jake Tate in the dead of night, in a crowded room, anywhere on God's green earth. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. She saw the exact moment recognition hit him, too. She watched his face cycle through a storm of emotions, surprise, guilt, and something that looked dangerously like longing, before he locked it all down behind the carefully neutral mask of a successful man. Raina. His voice was the same, that warm, low timbre that used to whisper promises in her ear. Education had smoothed its rough country edges, but it was him. Jake. The name felt foreign on her tongue, a relic from a time when she was young and foolish enough to believe in promises. Nola looked between them, her gaze sharp and intelligent. She missed nothing, that child. It was both a blessing and a constant worry. "Are you the prince from the fancy carriage?" she asked, her voice clear as a bell. A real laugh escaped Jake's lips. It was the first unguarded sound he'd made, and it hit Raina like a physical blow. "No, little one," he said, his eyes crinkling. "Just a man who used to live around these parts, coming back to see how things have changed." "Everything's changed," Nola said, matter-of-factly. "Mama says change comes whether you want it to or not, like weather or chickens getting old." Jake's expression softened as he studied the child, and Raina saw something else flicker in his eyes, something cold and calculating, like a man doing arithmetic in his head. He was counting the years. He was looking at Nola, then back at Raina, trying to make the numbers fit. Then his gaze shifted back to Raina, and whatever he'd been thinking remained locked away. Nola took a step closer to him. She looked up at this handsome stranger in his fine suit, her little face filled with a desperate, earnest hope. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please marry my mama, mister." Jake froze. The air crackled with unspoken history. Raina stiffened behind her daughter, the words stealing the breath from her lungs. Nola, completely unaware of the emotional grenade she had just detonated, clutched her rag doll tighter. "She's all I have left," she added, her voice trembling just a little. "I don't want her to be sad anymore. And I think you used to make her smile." Jake just stood there, speechless. No high-stakes business deal, no boardroom full of powerful men had ever prepared him for this. No one had ever asked him for something so real. Not in a very long time. That evening, after Jake had taken rooms at the hotel in town, Raina sat on her porch, watching the stars pop out one by one in the velvet sky. The past hadn't just knocked on her door. It had kicked it clean off the hinges, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that whatever happened next would change everything. For better, or almost certainly, for worse. The foreclosure notice arrived 3 days later. It was delivered by a nervous young bank clerk who couldn't seem to meet her eyes. He handed her the envelope and practically ran back to his horse, as if her bad luck might be contagious. 30 days. 30 days to pay the full amount or lose everything Clem had built, everything she had fought to hold on to. The number on the paper swam before her eyes. It was more than she could earn in 3 years, even if a miracle rain came and brought a miracle harvest. She sank onto the top porch step, the notice fluttering in her trembling hand like a trapped bird. "Mama? Are you crying?" Nola appeared beside her, settling on the weathered planks, her small shoulder pressing against Raina's arm. "Just dust in my eyes, baby girl." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but Nola had her father's intuition. She saw things other people missed. "It's about money, isn't it?" she asked. "The paper that man brought." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about their troubles made Raina's chest tighten until she could barely breathe. A child of 8 shouldn't carry these worries. A child of 8 should be chasing butterflies, not staring down the barrel of homelessness. "We'll figure something out," Raina said, forcing a steadiness into her voice that she did not feel. "The Gale women are fighters. You remember that." But later that afternoon, the vultures arrived. They were city men in expensive suits, their shoes kicking up dust as they examined her home, her barn, her land, like they were assessing a carcass. The older one, a man named Samuel Garrett, tipped his hat with a practiced courtesy that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Mrs. Gale," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil, "we understand you might be in a position where you'd be interested in selling this property." "I'm not interested," Raina said, her voice flat. "We're prepared to pay a fair market value," he continued, ignoring her. "Enough to clear your debts with the bank and leave you with a little something to start over, comfortably." I said, "I'm not interested." Garrett's smile thinned. "Perhaps you should reconsider, ma'am. We're aware of your situation at the bank." Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tense air. The lady said she's not interested. The voice carried an authority that made both city men turn around. It was Jake. He'd appeared on horseback, seemingly out of nowhere, sitting tall in the saddle with a quiet, dangerous confidence. Garrett's eyes sharpened, assessing this new player in the game. "And you are? Someone who has the lady's best interests at heart," Jake said, his gaze never leaving Garrett. The speculators exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. Garrett turned back to Raina. "Our offer stands through the end of the week. After that, you'll be dealing with the bank, and I assure you, they won't be nearly as generous." They tipped their hats and left, their expensive carriage kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over everything, making it feel dirtier. After they were gone, Jake dismounted, his expression troubled. "I heard about the foreclosure," he said. "News travels fast in a small town," Raina replied, the heat of embarrassment burning her cheeks. "Bad news travels fastest," he corrected gently. He took a step closer. "Let me help, Raina. I don't need your pity, Jake, or your money. It's not pity." He was standing right in front of her now, his voice low and intense. "Raina, I know what this place means to you, what Clem built here. Let me do something right, for once." The question that had been burning in her since he arrived finally broke free. Why now? Why come back after all this time, after 10 years of silence? Jake's face grew complicated, a mask of regret and something else she couldn't quite read. "Because I finally have something to offer," he said. "Because I've spent 10 years trying to become a man worthy of what I walked away from." She studied his face, seeing the boy she'd loved hidden beneath the hard lines of the man he'd become. But as he spoke, she noticed something else, a tension in his posture, the careful, deliberate way he chose his words. He was holding something back. Jake Tate was hiding a secret, and whatever it was bigger than his reasons for leaving. It was the real reason he had returned. That night, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the turmoil in her own heart, Raina wondered if accepting Jake's help would be their salvation, or if it would be the final thing that destroyed them completely. The next morning, driven by a restless energy, Raina decided to clean out Clem's old study. It was a room she'd mostly avoided since his passing, a place heavy with his memory. While dusting off an old bookshelf, her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open. Beneath it lay a small, dust-covered wooden box. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted it out. Inside, tied with a faded ribbon, were dozens of letters. The handwriting was painfully familiar. It was Jake's. Her hands trembled as she opened the first one, the paper brittle with age. It was dated just a few months after he'd left Cedar Ridge. "My dearest Raina," it began. "I know I have no right to write to you, but I can't stop thinking about you. I was a fool to leave, a coward, but I had nothing to offer you then except empty hands and emptier promises. I'm working in the silver mines now, saving every penny. One day I'll come back for you, I swear it." Letter after letter told the same story, a story of regret, of longing, of a desperate promise to return as soon as he'd made his fortune, a fortune he was building for her. She had never seen a single one. At the very bottom of the box, beneath all of Jake's letters, lay one final envelope. The handwriting on this one was Clem's. Her blood ran cold. "My dear wife," it read, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I pray you can find it in your heart to forgive an old man's foolishness. Jake's letters came regularly for years. I hid them from you. It was a selfish, terrible thing to do, I know that now. I had found happiness with you, and I was terrified of losing it to his ghost. But he was a good man, and he loved you. If he ever returns, know that I give you my blessing. You deserve all the love this world has to offer." The tears she'd been holding back for years finally fell, splashing onto the yellowed paper. Her anger at Jake, the cold, hard stone she'd carried in her heart for a decade, began to dissolve. It was replaced by a deeper, more complicated grief. Everything she believed about his abandonment, about their story, was a lie. A lie built not of malice, but of a good man's fear. That evening, she found him at the hotel. She walked right into the dining room, the box of letters clutched in her hands. "You wrote to me," she said, her voice shaking. Jake's face went pale. He stood up from his table so fast his chair nearly tipped over. How did you know?" "Clem didn't tell me. He hid them," she said, her voice breaking. "I found them this morning, along with his own confession." She placed the box on the table between them, watching his carefully constructed composure crumble. 10 years, she whispered. "I spent 10 years thinking you just forgot about me." "I never forgot," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Not for one single day, Raina. I came back. I came back 3 times in those first few years. But you were married. You looked happy. I thought it was for the best." "Best for who, Jake?" "For you," he said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "For your daughter. For the family you'd built." She studied his face, seeing the genuine pain there, the decade of regret. "Nola's not your daughter, Jake. She was born 2 years after you left." A flicker of something, relief maybe, but something else too, crossed his features. "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "The timing, I couldn't be sure." Would it have mattered? It would have meant my leaving caused even more pain than I already knew it had. They stood there in the quiet of the hotel dining room, the weight of 10 years of misunderstanding slowly, painfully, dissolving between them. The ghost of Clem was there too, a silent, regretful observer. Jake reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers, but she pulled back, because something still wasn't right. The letters explained the past, but they didn't explain the present. "There's something else, isn't there?" she said, her voice steady now. "Something you're not telling me, about why you really came back, right now." Jake's jaw tightened. He looked away. "Raina, the truth, Jake. After all this time, after all these lies, I deserve the truth." He finally met her eyes, and she saw the full weight of the secret he was carrying. "I knew about the foreclosure before I ever set foot back in this town," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew the railroad was targeting your land." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. You knew?" His next words were the ones that shattered what was left of her world. "I work for them, Raina. The Kansas City and Western Railroad. They sent me here. They sent me to secure the land deals, including yours." His voice dropped even lower. "But I swear to you I came back to help you, not to take advantage." As the full, sickening implication of his confession sank in, Raina realized the awful truth. The man she had just started to trust again, the man whose return had felt like a second chance, might be the very person orchestrating her family's final destruction. The community meeting was held in the old church 3 days later. The wooden pews were filled with families just like hers, farmers and ranchers with worried faces and calloused hands, all of them facing the same threat, all of them staring down the barrel of a foreclosure notice from the bank. Raina stood before them. She was no longer just a grieving widow fighting for her home. She was a woman who had learned that the people you trust the most are the ones with the power to hurt you the deepest. "They're counting on us to roll over," she told the crowded room, her voice ringing with a new steel she didn't know she possessed. "They think we're too poor, too tired, too beaten down to fight back. They think we'll just take their lowball offers and disappear. But they're wrong." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Hope, fragile but real, began to bloom in the dusty air. Jake stood in the back of the church, a shadow against the wall. He watched her, and she could feel his gaze. He was watching the woman he'd once loved transform into a leader, forged in the fire of his own betrayal. When she finished speaking, when the applause and shouts of support died down, he stepped forward into the aisle. The whole room went silent. "I have something that might help," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the church. He held up a thick leather folder. "What is that?" someone called out. "It's everything," Jake said. "Railroad contracts, bank agreements, internal correspondence about using forced foreclosures to acquire land for pennies on the dollar." He laid it all out. It was a conspiracy, plain and simple. The railroad, the bank, even the land speculators like Garrett, they were all in it together. It was proof. The room erupted. People surged forward, shouting questions, their fear turning to anger, their despair turning to a thirst for justice. But Raina saw the cost of this proof in Jake's eyes. He hadn't just acquired those documents. He'd stolen them. He had betrayed the very people who had made him a rich man. "You'll lose everything," she whispered to him later, after the crowd had dispersed, their anger now focused into a plan. "I've had 10 years to realize that everything I thought I wanted was worthless," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "It's all worthless without the things that truly matter." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to so badly. But the sting of his confession was still fresh. "How do I know this isn't just another lie?" she asked, her voice raw. "Another scheme? Another way to manipulate all of us, to get what you really want in the end?" Jake's face hardened with a grim resolve. "Because I'm resigning from the company," he said. "Tonight, I'm going to the telegraph office, and I'm sending a message that will not only end my career, it will probably land me in prison for corporate theft." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "And if I'm lying, Raina, then you'll have lost nothing you weren't already going to lose. Your land will still be gone." "But if I'm telling the truth," he finished, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you'll have a chance to save not just your home, but every family in this valley they're trying to destroy." As she watched him walk away, his shoulders set, heading toward the telegraph office to send the message that would detonate his entire life, Raina was torn. Was she watching an act of true redemption? Or was this the most elaborate, most cruel betrayal of all? Either way, she knew one thing for certain. By morning, the real battle would begin. And it was going to be a war. The fight stretched through the long, hot months of a Texas autumn. It was brutal and unforgiving. Jake's stolen documents had blown the lid off the conspiracy, but the railroad didn't just roll over. They fought back. And they fought dirty. Mysterious fires started breaking out in the dead of night. Livestock turned up dead in the fields, their water sources poisoned. Threatening letters, filled with crude warnings, were left on doorsteps. The community, once united in their anger, began to fray under the relentless pressure. Fear was a powerful weapon, and the railroad was using it with surgical precision. One evening, Nola, with the brutal honesty only a child possesses, asked the question that cut right to the heart of the problem. "Mama, why don't the sheriff and the judge just make them stop being mean?" And in that moment, Raina was struck with a terrible realization. She looked at the worried faces of her neighbors. She thought of the sheriff who was always too busy to investigate the fires, the judge who kept dismissing their complaints on technicalities. They couldn't help, because they were part of it. The sheriff, the judge, the local law, they were all on the railroad's payroll. They were part of the system designed from the very beginning to protect the powerful and crush the poor. The fight became public when Jake was called to testify in a federal court in Dallas. The railroad was suing him, trying to paint him as a disgruntled employee, a traitor who had stolen company secrets for his own personal gain. The prosecutor was ruthless. He twisted Jake's words, questioned his motives, and portrayed him as a villain. But Jake stood his ground. From the witness stand, his voice clear and steady, he looked directly at the railroad's lawyers. "I betrayed a company," he said. "A company that was stealing land and destroying lives. A company that was preying on widows and orphans. You're damn right I betrayed them. And I'd do it again." The case and the fate of Cedar Ridge landed in the lap of a federal judge named Harrison. He was an old, formidable man with a reputation for being tough, fair, and most importantly, a man who could not be bought. After weeks of testimony, after the railroad's lawyers threw everything they had at them, Judge Harrison made his ruling. He ruled in their favor. Every foreclosure was declared illegal and invalid. The families were to receive financial restitution for their losses and suffering. Cedar Ridge had won, but their victory came at a price. While the railroad was defeated in civil court, Jake still faced serious criminal charges for corporate espionage. The very act that had saved them all could still send him to prison for years. "I want to face whatever comes next together," Raina told him as they walked their land that evening, the land that was now safely, truly theirs. The setting sun bathed the fields in a golden light. "Because I finally understand," she continued, stopping to face him. "Faith isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and fighting side by side anyway." "I might be going to prison, Raina," he said, his voice heavy. "Then I'll wait for you," she answered without a second of hesitation. "We've already lost 10 years to misunderstandings and other people's lies. I'm not going to lose any more time to fear." As they stood there, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, a sense of peace settling between them for the first time, neither of them noticed the boy from the telegraph office riding up the lane. He was carrying a telegram, and it held news that would change everything once more. The telegram was from the federal prosecutor's office. Raina's hands shook as she read the words aloud. The public outcry over the railroad's tactics had been immense. Stories of their fight had been printed in newspapers across the country. Jake, far from being seen as a criminal, was being hailed as a hero, a whistleblower who had risked his own freedom to expose a corrupt corporation. Given his invaluable cooperation and the political climate, the prosecutor had decided to drop all criminal charges, effective immediately. Raina looked up from the paper, her eyes wide with disbelief. "So, you're free?" Jake took the telegram from her, reading it himself as if he couldn't trust his own ears. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and washed away the last 10 years of worry and regret. "Free to stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if you'll have me. Free to build something real this time. No more running." The official deed to their land arrived on a crisp autumn morning a few weeks later. Raina held the paper in her hands, her name printed in clear black ink. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like a prayer that had been answered. She stood on her porch, watching Nola chase chickens in the yard, her happy squeals echoing in the clear air. This was where her daughter belonged. This was home. She turned to Jake, who stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "I love you, Jake Tate," she said, the words coming easier than she ever thought they would. "I think, in my heart, I probably never stopped." His kiss was interrupted by a delighted shriek from the yard. "Are you getting married?" Nola yelled, running up to the porch. Can I wear Mama's wedding dress to be the flower girl?" Raina laughed through happy tears, pulling her daughter into a hug with her free arm. "Yes," she said, looking from Nola to Jake, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes to everything." The wedding was planned for Christmas. It was going to be a celebration not just for them, but for the entire valley. But as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the brown fields with a layer of white, a new shadow fell over their hard-won happiness. The railroad, though defeated in court, was not destroyed. They were appealing the federal ruling. Their new team of high-priced lawyers from back east claimed the original case had been decided on emotion and technicalities, not facts. They were demanding a new trial. Jake found the legal papers on their doorstep, left there sometime during the night. His face was grim as he read them. "They're not giving up, Raina," he said, the paper crinkling in his tight grip. This could drag on for years. They could bleed us dry." Raina looked at the snow falling, at the cozy light spilling from her kitchen window, at her daughter sleeping soundly inside. She looked at Jake. "Then we'll fight for years," she replied, her voice filled with a resolve that surprised even herself. But privately, a cold sliver of fear lodged itself in her heart. She wondered if their happiness was destined to be as brief and beautiful as a Texas spring, doomed to be scorched away by a brutal, unforgiving summer. The appeal was heard in the spring. And this time, the railroad came with bigger guns. Slick lawyers from New York City who twisted words until they meant nothing. They produced new witnesses, paid men who swore under oath that Jake had coerced them, that he'd bribed them into lying. They produced fabricated evidence that painted the entire Cedar Ridge case as an elaborate fraud, orchestrated by a bitter ex-employee seeking revenge. It was a nightmare. They were trying to rewrite history, to steal their victory right out from under them. But the community that had learned to fight together wasn't about to give up that easily. The railroad had underestimated them. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. They raised money, selling off livestock and mortgaging their futures to hire better lawyers of their own. They organized petitions that got sent all the way to Washington. But most importantly, they stood united. When one family was threatened, they all showed up on their porch with rifles and resolve. They were no longer a collection of scared farmers. They were an army, and their most powerful weapon stood less than 4 feet tall. The little girl who had once whispered a desperate plea to a stranger now stood before the panel of appellate court judges, her small hand clutching her mama's. Her voice didn't tremble. It was clear and strong and rang with the simple, undeniable power of truth. "Your Honors," Nola said, looking each of the stern-faced judges in the eye. "This isn't about money or land or big companies. This is about families. It's about having a place to call home, a place where you feel safe. That's all we ever wanted." The judges ruled unanimously in their favor. Their decision set a legal precedent that would protect small landowners across the entire territory for generations to come. The railroad's final appeal was denied. Their conspiracy, their corruption, was exposed to the entire nation. It was finally, truly, over. 6 months later, the Gale homestead, now the Tate homestead, buzzed with new life. Jake had proven himself not with one grand gesture, but with 1,000 small daily acts of devotion. He was there, mending fences, teaching Nola how to read, sitting by Raina's side on the porch swing during the quiet evenings that make up the fabric of a life. Their wedding had been simple and joyful, held right there in the yard under the big oak tree. The whole community had come to celebrate the triumph of love and resilience over greed and loss. The legal precedent their little town had set was already inspiring others. News came of other communities, in other territories, finding the courage to fight back against similar schemes. The spark they had lit in that old church had become a wildfire of resistance. As they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Nola leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Are you happy, Mama? She asked. Raina looked at her daughter, her beautiful, brave daughter. Then she looked at the man beside her, the man who had walked through fire and back to find his way home. The man who had learned that real treasure wasn't silver or gold, but the quiet, steady love of the people you choose as family. I'm more than happy, baby girl, Raina said, her voice soft. I'm content, and I'm exactly where I belong. The little girl who had once put all her hope into a whispered plea to a stranger now lived surrounded by the very family she had dreamed of. It was proof that sometimes the best and happiest endings come disguised as new beginnings, and that love, much like the stubborn Texas land itself, endures through every storm, every drought, and every season. I've got a small favor to ask before you go. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to double-check that you've liked this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small, free way you can help us continue to bring you stories like this one. I really do appreciate every single one of you.